My name is Sarah Matthews. I'm 28 years old, and I'm finally ready to tell the truth about my childhood that everyone envied. For years, people would look at me with that wistful expression and say, "You're so lucky to have such amazing parents." They'd point to the magazine articles, the community awards, the perfect family photos that lined our hallway like trophies of domestic bliss. What they didn't know was that I was living inside a meticulously crafted performance that never ended. Even when the curtains were drawn and the audience went home, the morning everything began to unravel started like any other Tuesday in our pristine suburban home. I was 17 then, rushing downstairs for breakfast before school, when I caught a glimpse of something that would haunt me for years. Through the kitchen doorway, I saw my mother, Rebecca Matthews, practicing her smile in the reflection of the chrome refrigerator. Not just any smile, the specific one she wore for parent-teacher conferences. The one that said, "I'm the perfect mother with the perfect daughter." She adjusted the corners of her mouth, tilted her head slightly to the left, and held it for exactly 3 seconds before letting it drop into an expression of complete exhaustion. My father, Dr. Michael Matthews, sat at the breakfast table behind, her oblivious to her rehearsal, reading through what looked like a script. I later learned it was his notes for the school board meeting that evening, where he would present himself as the concerned father advocating for better education funding. Every gesture, every passionate inflection, every moment of righteous indignation was planned and practiced like a Broadway performance. "Sarah, sweetheart," my mother called without turning around, her voice immediately switching to its public warmth. "Your breakfast is ready." The transformation was so seamless it made my stomach turn. I watched as she arranged my plate with the same precision she used for her Instagram posts, the ones that garnered thousands of likes and comments about her natural parenting style and effortless family life. As I sat down to eat, I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen either of my parents genuinely relaxed. Even in what should have been private moments, they seemed to be performing for an invisible audience. Or perhaps for each other, or maybe they'd been performing for so long they'd forgotten how to stop. My father looked up from his notes with that practiced smile, the one I'd seen him use on countless occasions when someone complimented him on raising such a well-adjusted daughter. "Big presentation today in chemistry class," he said, his voice carrying that perfect tone of supportive encouragement that had fooled teachers and neighbors for years. "Remember what we practiced about confidence and eye contact?" Even his advice felt scripted, pulled from some parenting manual he'd memorized, but never truly internalized. I nodded and took a bite of the perfectly prepared breakfast, tasting nothing but the bitter realization that I was living in a house of mirrors where everything reflected back a distorted version of what family was supposed to be. The worst part wasn't that my parents were performing, it was that they seemed to believe their own act so completely that they'd lost track of who they really were underneath all the carefully constructed personas. The sound of my mother's heels clicking across the marble floor marked the beginning of another day in our perfectly choreographed life. And I sat there wondering if I was the only one who could see through the elaborate facade we called home. The performance extended far beyond our kitchen conversations. Every aspect of our lives was curated, managed, and presented like we were living inside a reality show that never stopped filming. My mother's morning routine alone was a masterclass in calculated authenticity. She would wake up 45 minutes earlier than necessary, not to meditate or exercise, but to apply what she called her no makeup look and arrange her hair in what appeared to be an effortless bedhead style that actually required 3 different products and 15 minutes of careful tousling. I discovered this by accident one morning when I came downstairs early with a stomachache. Through the bathroom door, I could hear her practicing different versions of concern. "Oh, no. Are you feeling all right, sweetheart?" She'd say to her reflection, adjusting her facial expression until she achieved the perfect balance of maternal worry and competent reassurance. When I knocked on the door moments later, she delivered that exact line with such natural conviction that I almost believed she hadn't been rehearsing it. My father's performance was more subtle but equally calculated. He had perfected the art of the meaningful pause, the thoughtful nod, the way he'd remove his glasses and clean them slowly while considering important questions. These weren't natural gestures, they were techniques he'd learned from watching respected public figures and politicians. I caught him practicing in his study, asking himself questions and responding with those same measured, dignified reactions. The most disturbing part was how they performed their marriage for me. They would have these elaborate displays of affection whenever I was around, touching each other's hands across the dinner table, sharing meaningful looks, making inside jokes that felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous. But I'd noticed that when they thought I wasn't watching, they barely acknowledged each other's presence. They functioned like polite strangers sharing the same space, coordinating their performances but never truly connecting. Their friends and colleagues ate it up completely. At dinner parties, other couples would watch my parents with obvious envy, commenting on their rock-solid relationship and perfect communication. My mother would laugh at my father's stories with precise timing, and he would gaze at her with practiced adoration while she spoke. They had mastered the art of looking like they were genuinely listening to each other while actually monitoring the reactions of their audience. The community loved them. My father served on 3 different boards and volunteered at the local hospital. My mother organized charity events and ran a popular lifestyle blog called Balanced Living with Becca that featured our family prominently. They were the couple other parents pointed to as an example of doing it right. They were invited to every important social event, consulted on community decisions, and held up as pillars of successful family life. But I was beginning to understand that their success was built entirely on performance, and I was both their most important audience member and their most crucial prop. Every achievement of mine was carefully documented and shared, every milestone celebrated with the kind of enthusiasm that looked genuine but felt hollow. They weren't proud of me as their daughter. They were proud of me as evidence of their superior parenting skills. The realization hit me like a physical blow one evening when I overheard my mother on the phone with her sister discussing my acceptance into the honor society. It's so important for the blog, she was saying. The readers love success stories, and Sarah's achievements really reinforce our family brand. Family brand. The words echoed in my head for hours afterward, making me feel like nothing more than a product in their carefully curated lifestyle business. Living with performers meant that genuine emotions were not just discouraged, they were seen as disruptions to the carefully maintained narrative. I learned this lesson harshly during my junior year when I experienced my first real heartbreak. A boy I had been dating for 3 months, Jake Morrison, had suddenly stopped talking to me after rumors spread that I was too intense and had issues because I'd cried in front of him during a movie about family dysfunction when I came home. That day, devastated and needing comfort, I found my parents in the living room preparing for a dinner party they were hosting that evening. My mother was arranging flowers with the same meticulous attention she gave to everything else, while my father practiced telling an anecdote about a challenging case at the hospital. They both looked up when I entered, and I could see them quickly, assessing my emotional state like directors evaluating an actor's performance. "Sweetheart, you look upset," my mother said, but her tone carried a warning rather than comfort. Her eyes darted toward the clock, calculating how much time she had to deal with this disruption before their guests arrived. What happened? I tried to explain about Jake, about how humiliated and confused I felt, but as I spoke, I watched my parents exchange a look that I'd seen countless times before. It was their manage the situation look, the one they use when something threatened to interfere with their public image. My father stood up and put his hands on my shoulders, delivering what I now recognize as his crisis management speech. These things happen to everyone, he said with practiced sympathy. The important thing is how we handle disappointment. It builds character. His words were perfectly reasonable and probably what most parents would say, but they felt scripted, pulled from some handbook on appropriate parental responses. There was no real engagement with my pain, no acknowledgement that this was my first experience with this kind of rejection. My mother nodded along, adding her own rehearsed wisdom about how everything happens for a reason and how I was too. Good for someone who couldn't appreciate my wonderful qualities. But even as she spoke, I could see her mentally rearranging the evening schedule, figuring out how to get me cleaned up and presentable before the dinner guests arrived. "Why don't you go upstairs and take a nice hot shower?" she suggested, and I realized that my emotional crisis was being treated like a wardrobe malfunction, something to be quickly fixed so the show could go on. "Put on that blue dress I bought. And you can join us for dinner. The Hendersons are bringing their son David, and he's starting at Columbia in the fall." The suggestion that I should be ready to perform charm and availability for another boy just hours after having my heart broken felt like a slap. But I'd learned long ago that expressing anger or frustration with my parents' approach only led to lectures about gratitude and perspective. So I went upstairs, took the shower, put on the blue dress, and came down to play my role as the well-adjusted, resilient daughter who bounced back quickly from life's minor setbacks. That evening, I watched myself from outside my body as I made polite conversation with the Henderson's son, laughed at the right moments during my father's stories, and helped my mother serve dessert with a bright smile. The other adults commented on how poised and mature I was, how lucky my parents were to have such a delightful daughter. Inside, I felt like I was dissolving, but on the outside, I delivered the performance they expected later that night. After the guests had gone home and my parents were cleaning up, I heard my mother telling my father how well Sarah handled her little drama today. Little drama. That's what my first heartbreak had been reduced to, a minor inconvenience that I'd managed appropriately. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if I would ever be allowed to have real feelings in this house, or if everything would always be filtered through the lens of how it affected our family's image. The pressure to maintain the performance became suffocating during my senior year of high school. College applications were due, and suddenly every aspect of my academic and extracurricular life was scrutinized not for what it meant to me, but for how it would look to admissions committees, and more importantly, to the community watching our family's success story unfold. My mother had already planned the social media campaign around my college acceptances, complete with hashtags like #ProudMom and #HardWorkPaysOff. The breaking point came during a family meeting my parents called to discuss my college essay. I'd written something honest about struggling with anxiety and the pressure to be perfect, about learning to find my authentic voice despite external expectations. I thought it was some of my best writing, vulnerable, insightful, and real. But when I read it aloud to my parents, the silence that followed was deafening. My father was the first to speak, removing his glasses in that practiced gesture I'd come to dread. "Sarah, this is very well written, but I'm concerned about the message it sends." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Admissions committees want to see resilience and positivity. This essay makes you sound troubled." My mother nodded in agreement, though I could see her mentally calculating the damage this could do to our family's reputation if anyone ever read it. "Sweetheart, you're not troubled. You're successful and happy. Why would you want to present yourself as anything else?" Her voice carried that tone of confused disappointment, as if I'd suggested something completely irrational. I tried to explain that the essay wasn't about being troubled. It was about growth, about learning to navigate challenges authentically. But they couldn't see past the potential for this honesty to crack the perfect facade we'd spent years constructing. In their minds, admitting to struggle was admitting to failure, and failure was not part of our family narrative. "Let's think about this differently," my father said, pulling out a legal pad and pen. "What are some positive challenges you've overcome? Maybe your volunteer work at the animal shelter, or the way you balanced academics with your leadership roles." He was already rewriting my story, turning my genuine struggle with authenticity into a sanitized tale of well-rounded achievement. Over the next 2 hours, they systematically dismantled my honest essay and rebuilt it into something that sounded like it could have been written by any high-achieving student with perfect parents. All the real emotion was stripped away, replaced by inspirational platitudes about perseverance and family support. The final version was technically perfect and completely soulless, but it fit the image they needed to maintain. I submitted that essay to 17 different colleges, and every time I sent it, I felt like I was betraying myself a little more. But the strategy worked. I was accepted to several prestigious schools, and my parents' social media posts about my success generated hundreds of congratulatory comments from friends and acquaintances who saw our family as the epitome of the American dream. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was being celebrated for achievements that felt hollow, while the parts of myself that were real and struggling remained hidden. At graduation, when I was recognized as valedictorian, I stood at the podium looking out at an audience that included my beaming parents, and I delivered a speech about gratitude and opportunity that felt like the culmination of 18 years of performance. That night, at the graduation party my parents threw for me, I watched them work the room like seasoned politicians, accepting congratulations and deflecting praise with false modesty. "We're so proud," they kept saying, "but Sarah did all the work herself." It was the perfect response, humble enough to seem genuine, proud enough to take credit, and completely removed from any real understanding of what I'd actually experienced. During those 4 years of high school, as I got ready for bed that night, still wearing my graduation dress, I caught sight of myself in the mirror and realized I didn't recognize the person looking back at me. Somewhere along the way, I'd become as much of a performer as my parents, and I had no idea who I really was underneath all the carefully constructed achievements and appropriate responses. College should have been my escape, but I quickly discovered that 18 years of performance don't disappear overnight. I'd chosen Northwestern University partly because it was far enough from home to create some distance, but also because it had the kind of prestige that would photograph well for my mother's blog posts and generate the right kind of social media buzz. Even my rebellion was choreographed to maintain our family's image. My freshman roommate, Kelly, was everything. I thought I wanted to be spontaneous, emotionally available, unafraid to be messy and real. She would cry during sad movies, get genuinely angry when she felt wronged, and laugh until she couldn't breathe at things that weren't even that funny. Watching her live with such unfiltered authenticity was both inspiring and terrifying. I envied her freedom while simultaneously judging her lack of control. "You're so put together," she told me one evening as we were getting ready for a dorm party. She was struggling with her outfit, changing clothes 3 times and asking my opinion about everything. Meanwhile, I'd selected my outfit days earlier, chosen specifically to project the right balance of approachable and sophisticated. "I wish I had your confidence." But what she saw as confidence was actually the result of years of careful calculation. I knew exactly what image I wanted to project and how to achieve it. Not because I was secure in myself, but because I'd never learned to exist without an audience. Even alone in my dorm room, I found myself maintaining the performance, as if invisible cameras were recording my every move for some future documentary about the perfect family's perfect daughter. The first real crack in my facade came during a psychology class discussion about family dynamics. Professor Williams was talking about emotional authenticity and the difference between genuine connection and performed intimacy. As she spoke, I felt a recognition so sharp it was almost physical. She was describing my entire childhood, the elaborate choreography that had passed for love in my house. Many children from seemingly perfect families struggle with identity formation, she continued, because they've learned to prioritize external validation over internal awareness. They become expert performers but lose touch with their authentic selves. Her words hit me like a diagnosis I'd been waiting my whole life to receive. After class, I sat in the campus library trying to process what I'd heard. I pulled out my phone to call my parents, a habit I'd maintained since starting college, but for the first time I hesitated. What would I tell them? That I was learning about the psychological damage caused by their parenting style? That their perfect family was actually a case study in emotional dysfunction? Instead, I found myself writing in a journal for the first time since middle school. The words poured out of me, years of suppressed thoughts and feelings that I'd never been allowed to express. I wrote about the loneliness of being constantly on display, the exhaustion of never being able to just exist without considering how it would look to others, the deep confusion about what I actually wanted versus what I'd been programmed to want. When Kelly came back to the room that evening, she found me crying over my journal. It wasn't the controlled, purposeful crying I'd learned to do when the situation called for it. It was ugly, messy, and completely genuine. Instead of being alarmed or uncomfortable, Kelly sat down next to me and waited. She didn't try to fix me or offer solutions or remind me of all the reasons I should be grateful. She just sat there, and for the first time in my life, I felt seen, rather than performed for. I don't know who I am, I told her through tears, and saying it out loud felt like both a confession and a revelation. I've been playing a character for so long that I don't know if there's anyone real underneath. Kelly didn't respond with empty reassurances or motivational speeches. She just nodded and said, "That sounds really scary." Her simple acknowledgement of my fear, without trying to minimize or fix it, was more comforting than years of my parents' practiced sympathy. That night marked the beginning of my real education, the one that wouldn't appear on any transcript or generate any proud social media posts from my mother. I was learning to distinguish between who I was and who I'd been taught to be, and the process was more terrifying and more liberating than anything I'd ever experienced. The process of discovering my authentic self was like archaeological excavation, carefully brushing away layers of performance to uncover fragments of who I might have been if I'd been allowed to develop naturally. Some days I felt like I was making progress. Other days I felt like I was dismantling everything that had made me successful without having anything real to replace it with. My grades began to suffer, not because I was partying or skipping classes, but because I was questioning everything. When professors asked for my opinion, I would freeze, realizing I had no idea what I actually thought about anything. I'd spent so many years giving the responses that were expected of me that I'd never developed the skill of genuine critical thinking. My carefully constructed academic persona was crumbling, and I didn't know how to rebuild it on a foundation of authenticity. Phone calls with my parents became increasingly strained. They could sense something was different, but they interpreted my changes through their usual lens of performance management. When I mentioned struggling in a literature class, my mother immediately suggested hiring a tutor and creating a more structured study schedule. When I told my father I was considering changing my major from pre-med to psychology, He launched into a careful speech about the importance of stability and the respect that comes with being a physician. Psychology is a wonderful field, he said with that diplomatic tone he used when he wanted to disagree without seeming unsupportive. But you've worked so hard toward medical school. Why throw that away now? The question revealed everything to him. My years of academic achievement were an investment in a predetermined outcome, not an exploration of my interests and abilities. I tried to explain that I was no longer sure I'd ever wanted to be a doctor, that perhaps I'd been pursuing medicine because it was prestigious and would reflect well on our family. But this level of honesty was not something our family dynamic could accommodate. My parents listened with the same polite attention they gave to any performance, then redirected the conversation toward practical solutions and positive thinking. The breaking point came during Parents' Weekend in October. My mother and father arrived on campus with their usual fanfare, dressed perfectly and armed with conversation topics that would allow them to network with other parents while appearing to focus entirely on me. They'd reserved dinner at the most expensive restaurant in town and had planned a full itinerary of activities that would provide optimal photo opportunities for social media. But I was no longer the same girl who had left home 3 months earlier. The careful grooming, the practiced smile, the automatic responses that had once come so naturally now felt like a costume that no longer fit. During dinner, as my parents performed their familiar routine of proud parents celebrating their successful daughter, I found myself watching them as if from a great distance. "You look tired, sweetheart," my mother observed, though her tone suggested this was more of a criticism than concern. "Are you getting enough sleep? You know how important rest is for maintaining that healthy glow." Even her worry about my well-being was filtered through considerations of appearance and image. My father nodded in agreement, adding his own practiced wisdom about the importance of self-care and balance. But as he spoke, I realized that neither of them had asked me how I was feeling, what I was learning, or whether I was happy. They were performing the role of caring parents without actually demonstrating care. Something inside me snapped. "I'm not tired," I said, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. "I'm sad, I'm confused. I'm questioning everything I thought I knew about myself and our family." The words came out in a rush, bypassing the internal editor that usually filtered my responses for appropriateness. The silence that followed was deafening. My parents exchanged that familiar look, the one that meant they needed to manage a situation that threatened their carefully maintained narrative. But for the first time in my life, I didn't care about managing their discomfort. I was too busy experiencing the strange relief of finally saying something true. The aftermath of my outburst during Parents' Weekend revealed the true depth of my family's dysfunction. Instead of curiosity about my struggles or concern for my emotional well-being, my parents responded with what I can only describe as damage control. My mother spent the remainder of their visit asking probing questions designed to assess how much of this phase I might share with others, while my father offered measured advice about the importance of discretion and not airing family business. "Everyone goes through adjustment periods in college," my mother said as they prepared to leave Sunday morning. "The important thing is not to make any dramatic decisions while you're feeling unsettled." Her words were reasonable on the surface, but I could hear the underlying message. Don't do anything that might embarrass us or contradict the narrative we've built about our perfect family. After they left, I felt simultaneously relieved and completely alone. For the first time in my life, I'd spoken honestly to my parents about my inner experience, and they'd treated it like a PR crisis to be managed, rather than a daughter's pain to be understood. The realization that I'd been seeking genuine connection from people who were fundamentally incapable of providing it was devastating, Kelly found me sitting on our dorm room floor that evening, surrounded by family photos I'd been planning to display but now couldn't bear to look at. Each image told the same story, beautiful, successful people performing happiness with such conviction that they'd fooled everyone, including themselves sometimes. But now I could see the careful positioning, the practiced expressions, the way we'd all learned to hold ourselves for maximum impact. They look perfect, Kelly said, settling down beside me. She'd learned not to offer empty comfort or try to talk me out of my feelings, which made her one of the few people I could be honest with. But you don't look happy in any of these. She was right. Even in my genuine moments of achievement, graduation, award ceremonies, family vacations, there was something hollow in my expression. I looked successful, accomplished, grateful, but never truly joyful or at peace. I've been so focused on hitting my marks and delivering the expected performance that I'd never learned to simply experience my own life. The weeks that followed were some of the darkest of my college experience. I was mourning not just the relationship I thought I had with my parents, but the entire identity I'd built around being their perfect daughter. Without that role to play, I felt completely untethered. My grades continued to slip, not because I wasn't trying, but because I was paralyzed by the question of what I actually wanted to achieve versus what I thought I should want. I started seeing a counselor at the campus health center, Dr. Patricia Chen, who specialized in helping students navigate identity issues. Our first session was excruciating because I kept trying to present myself as a high-functioning person who just needed some minor adjustments rather than admitting the full extent of my confusion and pain. "Sarah," she said gently after I delivered, what amounted to a performance of someone seeking help. Nothing you've told me so far sounds like it's coming from you. It sounds like you're reporting on someone else's life. Her observation was so accurate, it made me physically uncomfortable. I don't know how to talk about myself without performing, I admitted, and even that admission felt like I was reading from a script about someone learning to be authentic. I don't know if there's a self underneath all this performance. Doctor. Chen leaned forward slightly, her expression completely focused and non-judgmental. Let's start with something simple, she said. When you're alone in your room at night, just before you fall asleep, what do you think about? Not what you should think about or what would be productive to think about, but what actually crosses your mind in those unguarded moments. The question stumped me completely. I realized that even my private thoughts had been curated and managed for so long that I'd lost access to genuine internal experience. Even in the moments that should have been most private, I was performing for an imaginary audience or judging myself against impossible standards. That night, I lay in bed trying to answer her question, and for the first time in years, I allowed my mind to wander without trying to direct or control it. What came up surprised me, not grand revelations or dramatic insights, but small, simple things I'd never allowed myself to acknowledge. I thought about how much I loved the smell of rain, how I felt peaceful watching trees move in the wind, how I was drawn to stories about people who'd found the courage to live unconventionally. The journey toward authenticity was not linear or pretty. There were days when I felt like I was making progress, uncovering small pieces of who I might be beneath all the performance. And other days when I felt completely lost, like I was dismantling my entire identity without having anything solid to replace it with. The hardest part was learning to tolerate uncertainty, something my perfectionist upbringing had never prepared me for. My relationship with my parents deteriorated steadily throughout my freshman year. Our phone calls became stilted performances where we all pretended everything was fine while carefully avoiding any topics that might lead to genuine emotional territory. They would ask about my grades, my social life, my future plans, all external markers they could understand and manage. I would give them updates that sounded positive and reassuring while sharing nothing of substance about my actual experience. During spring break, I made the mistake of going home instead of staying on campus or traveling with friends. I convinced myself that some time in familiar surroundings might help me feel more grounded, but instead, it was like returning to a museum of my former self. My childhood bedroom had been preserved exactly as I'd left it, but everything felt like artifacts from someone else's life. My mother had planned a full week of activities lunch with family friends, a shopping trip for new clothes, visits to my old teachers at the high school. Each event was designed to reinforce the narrative of my continued success and to provide content for her social media presence. I found myself slipping back into the familiar patterns of performance, but now the disconnect between my external presentation and internal experience was so stark it felt almost surreal. The most painful moment came during a dinner party my parents hosted for their closest friends. I was expected to entertain them with stories about college life, to demonstrate what a wonderful investment their parenting had been. As I sat there delivering perfectly crafted anecdotes about my professors and classmates, I watched the adults around the table respond with predictable delight and approval. "Sarah is just flourishing at Northwestern," my mother announced, beaming with practiced pride. "She's already thinking about graduate school and has so many opportunities ahead of her." The statement was technically true, but completely divorced from my actual emotional reality. I was barely passing my classes and had no idea what I wanted to do with my life, but those facts didn't fit the story they needed to tell. That night, after the guests had gone home, I overheard my parents discussing the evening in their bedroom. "She seemed a little off tonight," my father was saying. "Less polished than usual. I hope she's not getting too comfortable with mediocrity at school." My mother's response was even more telling. "Maybe we should schedule a call with her advisor. We need to make sure she's staying on track. This is a crucial time for building her resume for medical school applications." Listening to them discuss me like a project that needed better management was the final confirmation I needed that our relationship was beyond repair. They weren't concerned about my happiness or well-being. They were worried about maintaining the return on their investment in my success. I was not their daughter. I was their greatest achievement, and any deviation from perfection was seen as a threat to their own identity as superior parents. I spent the rest of that week going through the motions of being home while mentally preparing for my return to school. The contrast between the suffocating atmosphere of performed perfection at home and the messy but authentic relationships I was building at college had never been more stark. I realized that going back to Northwestern wasn't just returning to school, it was returning to a place where I was allowed to exist as a work in progress rather than a finished product. When my parents dropped me off at the airport for my flight back to campus, they both hugged me with the same practice warmth they'd always displayed. But I could feel the distance between us like a physical presence. We were all performing the roles of loving family members saying goodbye, but there was no real connection underneath the gestures. They had no idea who I was becoming, and I was beginning to understand that they had never known who I actually was, even as a child. Returning to campus after spring break felt like stepping back into a world where I was allowed to breathe. The contrast was so sharp that I spent my first night back just sitting in my dorm room, appreciating the simple freedom of not having to monitor every expression and gesture for appropriate impact. Kelly found me there at midnight, still in the clothes I'd traveled in, just staring out the window. "That bad?" she asked, settling into her desk chair with the kind of casual intimacy that had become precious to me. Over the months, she'd learned to read my emotional states better than my parents ever had, not because she was particularly intuitive, but because she paid attention to me as a person rather than as a performance. Worse, I said, and then found myself telling her everything, the dinner party performance. Overhearing my parents discuss me like a failing business venture, the suffocating sense of being trapped in a museum of my former self. As I spoke, I realized how much I'd grown in just 8 months away from home. The girl who had left for college would never have been able to articulate these observations, let alone trust someone else with them. Kelly listened without trying to fix anything or offer solutions, which had become one of the things I valued most about our friendship. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before saying, "It sounds like you're grieving." The observation surprised me with its accuracy. She was right. I was mourning the loss of the parents I thought I had, the family I believed we were, and the version of myself that had fit so perfectly into their world. But I was also discovering that grief could be productive. It was clearing space for something more authentic to emerge. My sessions with Dr. Chen became more focused after spring break. Instead of trying to figure out who I was supposed to be, we started exploring who I actually was underneath all the conditioning. It was slow, painstaking work, like learning a language I'd never been taught, despite having lived my entire life in a place where it was spoken. "What makes you angry?" She asked me during one session, and I realized I had no idea. I'd been taught to manage and redirect anger, to transform it into more socially acceptable emotions like disappointment or determination, but I'd never been allowed to simply feel it and learn what it might be telling me. "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't think I'm allowed to be angry." "Everyone is allowed to be angry," she said gently. "It's information. It tells us when our boundaries are being violated or when something important to us is being threatened. The question is whether you've been taught to listen to that information or to suppress it." Over the following weeks, I began the uncomfortable process of reconnecting with emotions I'd learned to suppress. Anger was the hardest because it felt so dangerous, so contrary to the nice, grateful, well-adjusted girl I'd been trained to be. But as I slowly allowed myself to acknowledge it, I discovered that my anger was actually protective. It was responding to years of having my authentic self dismissed and ignored. I was angry that my parents had valued my achievements more than my well-being. I was angry that I'd been taught to prioritize other people's comfort over my own truth. I was angry that I'd spent 18 years of my life performing a role instead of developing an identity. Most of all, I was angry that I'd been so thoroughly conditioned to believe that their way of living was not just normal, but superior. But alongside the anger came something unexpected: relief. Each emotion I allowed myself to feel, each authentic reaction I didn't immediately suppress, felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been held hostage for years. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time, like learning to walk all over again after years of being carried. My academic performance began to stabilize as I stopped trying to excel at subjects that had been chosen for me and started exploring areas that genuinely interested me. I changed my major to psychology despite my father's continued objections, and found myself engaged with learning in a way I'd never experienced before. For the first time, I was studying something because I wanted to understand it, not because it would look impressive on applications or generate the right kind of parental pride. By the end of my freshman year, I had made a decision that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. I was going to spend the summer working at a camp for underprivileged children instead of coming home or doing the prestigious internship my parents had arranged at my father's hospital. The decision felt both terrifying and necessary, like jumping off a cliff while learning to fly. When I called to tell my parents, the silence that followed my announcement was so long I felt the connection had been lost. Finally, my mother spoke, her voice carrying that carefully controlled tone she used when she was deeply upset. but trying to maintain composure. "Sarah, I don't understand," she said. "We've already told everyone about your internship at the hospital. Dr. Rodriguez is expecting you. And this looks so good for medical school applications. Why would you throw away such an important opportunity?" My father's response was more direct. "This sounds like self-sabotage," he said. "You're making decisions based on emotion rather than strategy. This is exactly the kind of impulsive choice that can derail a carefully planned future." But for the first time in my life, I wasn't making decisions based on their approval or disapproval. I was making them based on what felt right for me, even though I couldn't fully articulate why working with children in a completely non-medical setting felt more important than shadowing doctors in a prestigious hospital program. "I need to do something that feels meaningful to me," I tried to explain, though I knew they wouldn't understand the distinction. "I need to know what it feels like to choose something because I want to do it, not because it looks good or fits a plan someone else made for me." The conversation ended with them asking me to think about it for a few more days, which I knew was their way of hoping I'd come to my senses and return to their version of rationality. But my mind was made up. For the first time in my life, I was going to spend 3 months being nobody's daughter, nobody's perfect student, nobody's carefully crafted success story. Camp Wildwood was located in the mountains of Colorado, and from the moment I arrived, I felt like I could breathe more deeply than I had in years. The other counselors were college students from various backgrounds, united not by prestigious achievements or carefully managed images, but by a genuine desire to work with kids who had faced real challenges in their young lives. My cabin was assigned 8 girls between the ages of 10 and 12, all from families struggling with poverty, addiction, or other circumstances that had made a normal summer impossible. These children had no interest in my academic achievements or my parents' reputation. They didn't care that I'd been valedictorian or that I was attending Northwestern. They just wanted to know if I would listen to them, play games with them, and treat them with basic kindness. Working with those girls taught me more about authentic human connection in 3 months than I'd learned in 18 years of my carefully managed life. There was Maria, who was brilliant and funny, but had been labeled a problem child because she acted out when she felt ignored. There was Jennifer, who was so hungry for approval that she would apologize for everything, including things that weren't her fault. There was Ashley, who had been taking care of her younger siblings for so long that she'd forgotten how to just be a kid herself. Each of these children carried pain that my privileged background couldn't fully comprehend, but they also possessed a resilience and authenticity that humbled me. They felt their emotions completely. When they were happy, they were radiant. When they were sad, they grieved openly. When they were angry, they expressed it directly. They hadn't yet learned to perform their feelings or calculate the impact of their emotional responses on others. Watching them taught me what I'd been missing in my own development. They were whole people, complicated and real, dealing with circumstances beyond their control, but not hiding who they were in the process. They fought with each other and then made up with complete sincerity. They shared their fears and dreams without calculating whether those revelations made them look good or bad. They existed in the world as themselves, without apology or pretense. My relationship with them was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. For the first time in my life, I was valued not for what I achieved, but for how I treated people. Not for how I looked or what I represented, but for my capacity for genuine care and attention. When Jennifer had nightmares and needed someone to sit with her, she didn't choose me because I was impressive. She chose me because I made her feel safe. The transformation I experienced that summer was profound and irreversible. Away from the constant pressure to maintain an image, I discovered parts of myself I'd never known existed. I found that I was naturally good with children, not because I'd been trained in appropriate responses, but because I genuinely enjoyed their company and found their unfiltered honesty refreshing, I discovered that I loved being outdoors, that I had a talent for mediating conflicts, and that I felt most alive when I was helping others navigate their emotions rather than suppressing my own. More importantly, I learned what it felt like to be appreciated for who I was rather than what I accomplished. When 8-year-old Marcus told me I was his favorite counselor because I never got mad for stupid reasons, or when shy little Emma started seeking me out to share her drawings, these moments of connection felt more valuable than any academic honor I'd ever received. The camp director, Susan Martinez, became an unexpected mentor. She was a woman in her 50s who had dedicated her career to working with children from difficult backgrounds, and she had a way of seeing through facades that reminded me of Dr. Chun. During our weekly staff meetings, she would check in with each counselor not just about their cabin assignments, but about their personal growth and emotional well-being. "You're different than when you arrived," she told me during one of these conversations in late July. "You seem more present, more yourself." Her observation was accurate. I did feel more present, more connected to my own experience rather than monitoring it from the outside. "I think I'm learning who I am when I'm not trying to be impressive," I told her, and saying it out loud felt like a revelation. For the first time in my life, I was existing without an agenda, without trying to build towards some predetermined outcome or maintain some carefully constructed image. Susan nodded thoughtfully. "That's one of the gifts of working with children who face real adversity," she said. "They have excellent bullshit detectors. They respond to authenticity because they need to know they can trust the adults in their lives. You can't fake genuine care, and you can't perform your way into a real relationship with a kid who's been let down by too many adults already." Her words stayed with me as I continued working with my cabin of girls. I realized that these children were teaching me something my parents had never been able to model: how to be in relationship with others without constantly calculating the impression you're making. They loved me not because I was perfect, but because I was consistent, honest, and genuinely invested in their well-being. The hardest part of the summer was the weekly phone calls with my parents. They would ask about my camp experience with the same tone they might use to inquire about a volunteer activity that would look good on a resume. They seemed unable to understand that this wasn't a strategic career move or a character building exercise. It was the first time in my life I'd chosen to do something purely because it felt right to me. "Are you at least keeping a journal?" my mother asked during one call. "This could make a great essay for graduate school applications. How working with disadvantaged children gave you perspective on your own privileges." Even my most authentic experience was being filtered through their lens of how it could be used to advance my academic career. Tried to explain that the value of the experience wasn't in how it would look to admissions committees, but in how it was changing my understanding of myself and what I wanted from life. But these concepts were completely foreign to them. In their world, experiences had value only insofar as they contributed to external markers of success. By August, I dreaded those weekly calls. The contrast between the authentic connections I was building at camp and the performed conversations with my parents became more painful each week. I was living two completely different lives, one where I was valued for my genuine self, and another where I was expected to maintain the illusion of being their perfect daughter who had temporarily gotten sidetracked, but would eventually return to their predetermined path. The end of camp was devastating in ways I hadn't anticipated. Saying goodbye to the children felt like leaving a part of myself behind, but more than that, it meant returning to a world where authentic emotion and genuine connection were not valued the way they had been in this protected environment. Knew that in a few weeks I'd be back at school, and eventually I'd have to face my parents again. And I wasn't sure I could maintain the progress I'd made while navigating those relationships. Returning to Northwestern for my sophomore year felt like stepping between two worlds. I carried with me the authenticity and emotional openness I'd discovered over the summer, but I also knew I'd have to navigate the expectations and pressures that came with my previous identity as the perfect student from the perfect family. The challenge was learning how to honor what I'd discovered about myself while existing in systems that rewarded performance over authenticity. Kelly immediately noticed the change in me. "You look different," she said as we unpacked our belongings in our new shared apartment off campus. "More settled, somehow. Less like you're auditioning for something." Her observation was perceptive. I did feel less like I was constantly performing, though I wasn't sure how long that feeling would last under academic pressure. My classes that fall reflected my shift in priorities. Instead of loading up on pre-med requirements to satisfy my parents' expectations, I'd chosen courses that genuinely interested me: developmental psychology, social work theory, and a creative writing workshop. For the first time, I was learning because I wanted to understand something, not because I needed to achieve a certain grade or impress anyone with my course selection. The creative writing class proved to be particularly transformative. Professor James encouraged us to write from personal experience, to mine our own lives for material that might resonate with others. My first assignment was a personal narrative about a formative experience, and without consciously deciding to do so, I found myself writing about the summer at camp and the contrast between authentic connection and performed relationship. I read my piece aloud to the class. Something unexpected happened. Other students began sharing their own experiences with family pressure, with the gap between their public and private selves, with the challenge of discovering who they were beneath everyone else's expectations. I realized I wasn't alone, and feeling like I'd been living someone else's life, that many of my peers were struggling with similar questions about authenticity and identity. One student, David, approached me after class. "Your piece really resonated with me," he said. "I've been premmed for 3 years because my parents expect it, but I've never actually wanted to be a doctor. Hearing you talk about choosing psychology because it felt right to you made me realize I might have options I've never considered." These conversations became a regular part of my week. Students would seek me out to discuss their own struggles with family expectations, with the pressure to maintain perfect facades, with the fear of disappointing parents who had invested so much in their success. I discovered that my willingness to be honest about my own confusion and growth made others feel safer to examine their own lives more critically. Dr. Chan noticed the change in me immediately when we resumed our sessions. "You seem more grounded," she observed, "less fragmented. What's been different for you since we last met?" I told her about the summer, about the children who had taught me what authentic relationship looked like, about the relief of being valued for who I was rather than what I achieved. "It sounds like you experienced unconditional positive regard for the first time," she said. "The children at camp appreciated you without agenda, without trying to shape you into something else. That's a powerful corrective experience for someone who grew up with highly conditional love." Her words helped me understand why the summer had been so transformative. I'd experienced what it felt like to be accepted completely without having to earn that acceptance through performance or achievement. The children have loved me because I was kind to them, because I listened to them, because I showed up consistently, not because I impressed them or reflected well on them or contributed to their own sense of success. But this understanding also made my relationship with my parents more painful. Our weekly phone calls became increasingly difficult as the contrast between conditional and unconditional love became more stark. They would ask about my grades, my future plans, my internship applications for the following summer, but they never asked how I was feeling or what I was learning about myself. Your mother mentioned you're taking creative writing. My father said during one call, his tone suggesting this was a concerning development. I hope you're not losing sight of your science requirements. Medical schools want to see a strong foundation in the core subjects. I tried to explain that I was no longer planning to apply to medical school, that I was considering graduate programs in psychology or social work, but this information was simply incomprehensible to them. In their minds, I was having a temporary crisis of confidence that would resolve itself once I came to my senses and returned to their carefully planned path. The conversation ended with them suggesting I schedule a meeting with a pre-med advisor to get back on track, as if my exploration of my authentic interests was a derailment rather than a healthy development. I hung up feeling exhausted and frustrated, but also more certain than ever that I was moving in the right direction, even if that direction was completely invisible to the people who had raised me. The winter of my sophomore year brought what Dr. Chun called a crisis of integration, the challenge of maintaining my authentic self while still existing in relationship with people who preferred my performed version. This was particularly difficult during winter break, when I had no choice but to return home for 3 weeks and navigate the complex dynamics of my family during the holidays. My parents had planned their usual elaborate Christmas celebration, complete with a dinner party for 40 of their closest friends and colleagues. In previous years, I had been a central part of the entertainment, charming the guests with stories about my achievements and future plans. But this year, I felt like I was preparing for a role in a play I no longer wanted to perform in. The night of the party, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, practicing responses to the inevitable questions about school, career plans, and whether I was dating anyone suitable. But instead of feeling prepared, I felt sick. The thought of spending an entire evening performing the role of the perfect daughter for an audience of people who didn't actually know or care about me felt unbearable. When the first guests arrived, I tried to slip into my familiar role, but something had fundamentally shifted. When Mrs. Henderson asked about my medical school plans, I found myself saying, actually, I'm not sure medicine is the right path for me anymore. I'm exploring other options. The words came out before I could stop them, and the look of confusion and concern that crossed her face was immediately mirrored by my mother's expression across the room. The evening became a series of similar moments, where my authentic responses clashed with the expectations of the audience. When asked about my summer at camp, I talked about the children I'd worked with and how much the experience had taught me about genuine connection, rather than framing it as a resume-building volunteer experience. When someone complimented my parents on raising such a well-adjusted daughter, I found myself questioning what well-adjusted actually meant and whether it was something to aspire to. My father pulled me aside during dessert, his face wearing the expression I'd learned to associate with damage control. You seem to be going through some kind of phase, he said quietly. I understand that college can be a time of questioning and exploration, but this isn't the time or place for that kind of uncertainty. These people look up to our family, and your confusion reflects poorly on all of us. His words crystallized something I'd been struggling to articulate. In his mind, my growing self-awareness and authenticity were problems to be managed rather than developments to be celebrated. My questioning wasn't seen as healthy growth. It was seen as a threat to the family brand they'd spent years building. That night, after the guests had gone home, I lay in my childhood bed staring at the ceiling and made a decision that would change everything. I was going to stop protecting my parents from the truth about who I was becoming. I was going to stop performing the role of their perfect daughter, even if that meant disappointing them, even if it meant they could no longer use me as evidence of their superior parenting. The conversation happened the next morning over coffee in our kitchen. I told them everything about the therapy, about the identity crisis, about my growing understanding that their version of perfection had come at the cost of my authentic development. I explained that I loved them but could no longer pretend to be someone I wasn't, that I needed them to know and accept the real me. Even if that person was messier and less impressive than the daughter they'd created, the silence that followed was the longest of my life. My mother was the first to speak, her voice carefully controlled but shaking slightly. "Sarah, I think you're being very ungrateful," she said. "We've given you every opportunity, every advantage. We've supported your dreams and celebrated your achievements. How can you sit there and criticize the way we've raised you?" My father's response was more analytical but equally defensive. "It sounds like someone has been filling your head with psychological theories that are making you question a perfectly healthy family dynamic," he said. "This therapist you're seeing, maybe it's time to consider whether her influence is helpful or harmful." Neither of them could hear what I was actually saying. They couldn't understand that I wasn't criticizing them to hurt them, but trying to have an honest conversation about our relationship for the first time in my life. They interpreted my authenticity as ingratitude, my growth as rebellion, my attempts at genuine connection as attacks on their character. The rest of my time at home was tense and uncomfortable. We maintained the surface politeness we'd always used, but underneath was a new awareness that we were fundamentally incompatible as people. I continued to perform their roles as loving, supportive parents, and I continued to exist as myself, but there was no real meeting point between those two realities. When I returned to school in January, I felt both relieved and heartbroken. I'd chosen authenticity over approval, truth over comfort, but the cost was the relationship I'd thought I had with my parents. I was learning that sometimes growing up means accepting that the people who raised you may never be able to see or accept who you really are. The spring semester of my sophomore year became a period of rebuilding, learning to construct an identity based on my own values and interests rather than external expectations. Without the pressure to maintain my parents' approval, I felt free to explore aspects of myself that had been suppressed for years. I joined a support group for students dealing with family dysfunction, started volunteering at a local crisis hotline, and began writing poetry for the first time since childhood. Support group was particularly healing. Meeting weekly with 8 other students who were navigating similar challenges with family expectations helped me understand that my experience wasn't unique or shameful. There was Marcus, whose immigrant parents had sacrificed everything for his education, but couldn't understand his desire to study art instead of engineering. There was Jennifer, whose mother had lived vicariously through her achievements for so long that she'd never developed her own identity separate from being the perfect daughter. Listening to their stories helped me gain perspective on my own situation. I began to see my parents not as villains who had deliberately damaged me, but as people who had been shaped by their own upbringing and cultural pressures. They genuinely believed that love meant pushing me toward success, that protection meant shielding me from failure, that good parenting meant creating a child who reflected well on the family. They had no framework for understanding that their version of love had been suffocating rather than nurturing. This understanding didn't excuse their behavior or make our relationship easier, but it helped me move from anger toward something more like compassion. They had done their best with the tools they had, even if those tools had been inadequate for raising a child who needed authentic connection more than perfect achievement. My academic work began to reflect this new understanding. I wrote papers about the psychology of perfectionism, the impact of conditional love on child development, and the cultural factors that prioritize achievement over emotional well-being. For the first time, my coursework felt personally meaningful rather than just academically challenging. Professor Williams, who had taught the psychology class that first opened my eyes to family dysfunction, became another important mentor. She encouraged me to consider graduate programs that would allow me to work with families dealing with similar issues. "You have lived experience that would make you an effective therapist," she told me. "Your understanding of these dynamics comes from the inside, which gives you credibility and empathy that can't be taught." The idea of becoming a therapist felt right in a way that pre-med never had. I could imagine helping other young people navigate the gap between who they were expected to be and who they actually were. I could use my experience with performed perfection to help families learn more authentic ways of connecting. For the first time, I had a career goal that emerged from my genuine interests and values rather than external expectations, but pursuing this path meant having difficult conversations with my parents about my future plans. Our relationship had been strained since my honesty over winter break, but I knew I needed to tell them about my decision to apply to graduate programs in clinical psychology rather than medical school. The conversation took place during one of our increasingly awkward phone calls in March. When I explained my new direction, the silence was so long I thought they might have hung up. Finally, my mother spoke, her voice tight with what I recognized as controlled panic. "Sarah, I'm very concerned about this decision," she said. "Psychology is such an uncertain field. The job market is competitive, the pay is inconsistent, and there's so much less prestige than medicine. Are you sure you're not just avoiding the challenge of medical school?" My father's response was more direct. "This sounds like you're making life decisions based on emotional reactions rather than practical considerations," he said. "You're throwing away years of preparation and a guaranteed successful future for something that seems like therapy for yourself rather than a real career." I tried to explain that helping others wasn't therapy for myself, that I had genuine passion for understanding human psychology and family dynamics, that I wanted a career where I could make a meaningful difference in people's lives rather than just earning prestige and money. But these concepts were foreign to them. In their world, career choices were about status and security, not personal fulfillment or social contribution. The conversation ended with them asking me to think carefully about such a major decision, and suggesting I speak with their friend Dr. Morrison, a successful physician, about the benefits of staying in medicine. I agreed to consider their concerns, but I knew my mind was made up. For the first time in my life, I was choosing a path that felt authentic to me, regardless of whether it impressed anyone else. That night, I called Kelly and told her about the conversation. She listened with the kind of supportive attention I'd learned to value above all else, then said simply, "It sounds like you're finally living your own life instead of theirs." Her words captured exactly what I was feeling, the strange combination of liberation and loneliness that came with choosing authenticity over approval. My junior year began with a sense of purpose I'd never experienced before. I'd been accepted into an advanced psychology program that would allow me to begin clinical training, and for the first time, my academic work felt aligned with my genuine interests and values. But the cost of this authenticity was becoming increasingly clear. My relationship with my parents was deteriorating beyond repair. Our communications had dwindled to brief, surface-level exchanges. They would ask about my grades, and I would give positive but vague responses. They would mention family events and social gatherings, and I would politely decline to attend when possible. We had developed an elaborate dance of avoidance, each of us protecting ourselves from the disappointment of the others. The breaking point came during Thanksgiving of my junior year. I had planned to spend the holiday with Kelly's family, who had invited me warmly and without agenda. But my parents insisted I come home for what they called an important family discussion. I should have trusted my instincts and declined, but some part of me still hoped we might find a way to bridge the growing gap between us. The discussion turned out to be an intervention of sorts. My parents had enlisted the help of Dr. Morrison, their physician friend, and my high school guidance counselor, Mrs. Patterson, to convince me that I was making a terrible mistake with my career choice. They had prepared what amounted to a presentation about the benefits of medicine and the risks of psychology, complete with salary comparisons and job market statistics. We're all here because we care about you and want to see you succeed, my mother began, her voice carrying the tone she used for her most serious conversations. We're concerned that you're making decisions based on emotion rather than logic, and we want to help you see the situation more clearly. Dr. Morrison launched into a speech about the respect and financial security that came with being a physician, while Mrs. Patterson reminded me of my exceptional academic record and suggested that I was settling for less than my potential. They spoke about me as if I weren't in the room, analyzing my choices and motivations with the kind of clinical detachment usually reserved for case studies. As I sat there listening to them dissect my life decisions, I felt something shift inside. Me, the part of me that had always sought their approval, that had desperately wanted to be the daughter they envisioned, finally died. I realized that no amount of achievement would ever be enough for them unless it was achievement on their terms, and no version of success would satisfy them unless it reflected their values rather than mine. I appreciate your concern, I said when they finished their presentations, but I'm not asking for your approval anymore. I'm 20 years old, and I'm capable of making my own decisions about my life and career. I understand you're disappointed, but your disappointment is not my responsibility. The silence that followed was profound and final. My mother's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, hurt, anger, and finally a kind of cold withdrawal that I'd never seen before. My father removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly, but for once, the gesture didn't precede measured wisdom. He seemed genuinely at a loss for words. If that's how you feel, my mother said finally, then I think this conversation is over. Her tone carried the kind of finality that meant more than just the end of our discussion. She was ending our relationship as we had known it, and we all understood that some lines, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. I left their house that afternoon knowing I would never live there again, never again try to earn their approval or fit into their vision of who I should be. The drive back to campus felt like traveling between two different worlds, leaving behind the museum of my performed childhood and returning to the place where I was learning to be real. Kelly found me in our apartment that evening, sitting on the couch with my suitcase still by the door. How did it go? She asked, though my expression probably answered her question before I spoke. It's over, I said, and felt the truth of those words settle into my bones. The relationship I thought we had, the family I thought we were, it's all over. And I think I'm okay with that. She sat down beside me and we remained quiet for a long time. There wasn't much to say. I was grieving the loss of my parents while simultaneously feeling more free than I'd ever felt in my life. It was possible to feel heartbroken and relieved, at the same time to mourn what I'd lost while celebrating what I'd gained. That night, I called Susan Martinez, my former camp director, who had become an important source of support and guidance. I told her about the intervention, about the final break with my parents, about the strange mixture of sadness and liberation I was experiencing. Growing up sometimes means accepting that the people who raised us may never understand who we're becoming, she said gently. It doesn't mean they're bad people or that you're ungrateful. It just means you've outgrown the relationship they were capable of having with you. Her words helped me understand that this ending was also a beginning. The start of building a life based on my own values and authentic relationships rather than performed connections and conditional love. Part 16, 5 years have passed since that final conversation with my parents. And I'm writing this from my office at the Family Therapy Center where I work as a licensed clinical social worker. The journey from that confused, performing teenager to this person who helps other families navigate similar struggles has been neither linear nor easy, but it has been worth every difficult moment. I graduated from Northwestern with a degree in psychology and went on to complete my master's in clinical social work at the University of Chicago. Throughout graduate school, I specialized in family therapy and adolescent development, drawn repeatedly to working with young people who were struggling to establish their identity, separate from their parents' expectations. My personal experience became a source of strength rather than shame. I could recognize the signs of performed perfection because I had lived it, and I could offer hope to families trapped in similar patterns because I had found a way out. My practice focuses primarily on what I call achievement trauma, the psychological damage that occurs when children are loved conditionally based on their ability to meet external standards rather than their inherent worth as human beings. I work with teenagers who are having panic attacks about college applications, with young adults who don't know who they are beyond their accomplishments, and with parents who genuinely believe that pushing their children toward success is the highest form of love. The work is both challenging and deeply meaningful. Last week, I met with a family where the 16-year-old daughter was cutting herself in response to the pressure to maintain perfect grades while participating in 5 different extracurricular activities. Her parents, both successful professionals, couldn't understand why their daughter was acting out when they had given her every opportunity. Sitting in that session, I saw myself at 16 desperate for authentic connection, but trapped in a system that valued performance over PERSONHOOD. My relationship with my parents remains complicated. We haven't spoken directly in 3 years, though I occasionally hear updates through extended family members. They continue to live their carefully curated lives, and from what I understand, they've developed a narrative about my choices that allows them to maintain their sense of themselves as good parents. In their version of events, I was influenced by bad therapists and made poor decisions. Despite their excellent guidance, I've stopped hoping they will ever understand or acknowledge the validity of my perspective. I've learned that some relationships are too fundamentally incompatible to repair, and that accepting this reality is healthier than continuing to exhaust myself trying to build bridges to people who are standing on the other side with demolition equipment. But I've also built a chosen family that sustains me in ways my biological family never could. Kelly remains one of my closest friends, and her family has essentially adopted me as their own. Dr. Chen, my college therapist, became a mentor and colleague. Susan Martinez from the camp continues to be a source of wisdom and support. I've learned that family isn't always determined by blood sometimes. It's determined by who shows up consistently with unconditional love and authentic presence. I'm also in a relationship now with someone who knew nothing about my background when we met, who fell in love with who I am rather than what I've achieved. David is a teacher who works with special needs children, and his capacity for unconditional positive regard reminds me daily what healthy love looks like. We're planning to marry next year, and we've already agreed that when we have children, we will prioritize their emotional well-being over their achievements, their authenticity over their performance. Looking back, I can see that my parents weren't evil people. They were damaged people who passed their damage on to me because they didn't know any other way to love. They had been raised in families where worth was conditional, where love had to be earned through achievement, where vulnerability was weakness and authenticity was self-indulgence. They gave me what they had been given, which was conditional. Love disguised as high standards, but I also know that understanding their limitations doesn't obligate me to accept their treatment or continue trying to earn their approval. I spent too many years believing that if I could just explain myself clearly enough, perform well enough, achieve enough success, they would finally see and accept who I really was. I know now that their inability to do so was about their own limitations, not about my worth. The work I do now with families gives me hope that these patterns can be interrupted. I see parents who are willing to examine their own conditioning, who are learning to love their children for who they are rather than who they might become. I see teenagers who are finding their voices and learning to trust their own instincts despite external pressure. I see families healing from generations of conditional love and learning to create authentic connections everyone thought I had. Perfect parents, and in many ways, I did if perfection is defined by external achievement, social status, and the ability to maintain appearances. But I learned that perfection is the enemy of authenticity, that performed love is ultimately hollow, and that the most beautiful families are often the messiest ones, where people are allowed to be human and imperfect and real. I'm no longer anyone's perfect daughter, and that has made all the difference. I am simply myself, flawed, growing, authentic, and finally genuinely happy. And that, I've learned, is more than enough. The story I thought was about having perfect parents was actually about learning to parent myself, to give myself the unconditional love and acceptance I had always craved. In losing the family I thought I had, I found the person I was always meant to be. And that person, it turns out, was worth the long, difficult journey to discover. Today, when people tell me I'm lucky to have such a successful career and stable life, I smile and thank them. But I know that my real luck wasn't in having perfect parents. It was in finding the courage to stop performing their version of perfection and start living my own imperfect, authentic, beautifully real life.